In this video we're going to look at how we can add nullable columns to a database table using Django's model classes. And we're also going to see how we can handle filtering null values when we're performing queries to the database. We'll also see how null values affect ordering when we're getting back records. And finally we'll look at the COALESCE function in databases to see how we can use that to provide a default value when there is a null value. So let's get started. I have Visual Studio Code open here, and what we're going to do to start with is we're going to look at the restaurant model that we've been working with throughout this series, and I'm going to add a new field to this model. We already have these fields here, but I'm going to add a new one, and we're going to make that a nullable field in the database. So let's say that for a restaurant we want to store the capacity of that restaurant. That's the number of people that can be in the restaurant, the maximum number at a given time. So we want to store that information in the database, but a restaurant might not necessarily know what its capacity is, so we want to make this a nullable value. What I'm going to do underneath the existing fields is create a new field here which we'll call capacity, and this is going to store the number of people that can be in the restaurant at a given time. So we're going to make this a positive small integer field, and what we can do when we instantiate that is we can pass some keyword arguments that are going to modify how the underlying column is created. So what I'm going to do in order to make this nullable in the database is pass the null equals true keyword argument in here, and I'm also going to pass a blank equals true argument so that we can accept blank values when we submit a form in Django. That's not going to be applicable to this video, but that's how you would do that. The important thing to make the database column nullable is to pass the null equals true keyword argument. And again, from a data modeling perspective, the reason we make this nullable is because a restaurant might not necessarily know what their capacity is. So we want to give them the option of not passing a value in there and making that null. So now that we've changed that column, or added a new column rather, what I'm going to do is run the python manage.py make migrations command, and that's going to create the migration file for that change. And then once we've done that, we can run the migrate command. Now I have the database browser for SQLite open here, so what we're going to do is go to the restaurant table where we've added that new column, and if we click modify table, we're taken to this window here. Now you can see all the columns that are in this table. If we go down, we can see the capacity column, and that is the only column that has the not null constraint unchecked. So this is the only column that we are allowing null values to be entered into. So we've added that nullable column. Let's now have a look at the existing records in the restaurant table. If we look at those records, you can see that for the capacity column, every single one of those records is null, and that's because this is existing data. We've just added a new column and we've said that the value can be null in that column, and that is going to make all existing rows have a null value in the capacity column. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to now query this column using Django. We're going to go to the 𝗰𝗽𝗶𝗹 file, and we're going to start writing some queries in here. So what I'm going to do is print the results of a query, and the query is going to be restaurant.objects.filter. And what we want to do is get back all the restaurants whose capacity value is null. So in order to do that, we can use a lookup in Django. We specify the capacity field and then 2 underscores, and the lookup is called isNull. So if we want to get back all the rows where the capacity is null, we can set that equal to true, and we can execute the query and get back the results of that. So let's clear the terminal, and we're going to run the run script command here. So python manage.py run script, and the name of the script is 𝗰script.py. Once we run that, we get back all of the rows in the table where the capacity column has a null value. And as we just saw in SQLite browser here, every single row that we have has a null value at the moment, so that's giving us back every single row in the table. If we change the true to false here, and we re-execute this query, we expect to see an empty query set, and that's what we get below. And just as a quick point, I'm going to uncomment connection.queries and rerun this script so that we can see the SQL that is being executed. And you can see at the bottom here, in fact let me make this a little bit bigger, the query has a where clause where we're looking at the capacity column and we're checking if that is not null using this statement here. So we're checking if the capacity is not null, and that is important. We're not checking if the capacity is equal to null, and that's because no two nulls are the same in an SQL database. So we use the isNot operators here in order to make that check. And of course, if we change the false back to true here for the isNull lookup, the isNot will change to simply checking if it is null. So let's now go back to our script, and we're going to pull out 2 restaurants from the database. So I'm pulling out restaurants here using the first and last functions, and what we're going to do is we're going to set the capacity field for both of these. So let's set the first one to a capacity of 10, and let's set restaurant 2's capacity by setting that equal to, in this case, let's say 20. Once we've set the capacity, we need to call the save function for both of these restaurants. So that's going to set that in the database, and this time when we query for the restaurants and look at the restaurants whose capacity is not null, we are going to get back the first and last restaurants that we've set here to 10 and 20 respectively. So let's clear the terminal and rerun the ORM script. And in fact, I'm going to comment out connection.queries and we can rerun this. And this time our query set contains the 2 restaurants whose capacity we have set here, and therefore that is how the isnull lookup is working. It's looking for any restaurant whose capacity is not null, and that is now going to be these 2 here. So let me just delete this code here, and what we can also do, of course, is chain another function here, for example the .count function. So this will give us back the number of restaurants whose capacity is a not null value, and that gives us back 2 at the bottom here. So that's the basics of how to query a database table using a Django model and get back all of the rows where a particular column is null or a particular column is not null. What we're going to do now is go back to the Django documentation. And we have this page here on the model field reference. I'll link this below the video. What we're going to look at is the field options here, and we have the field.null option that we saw when we added that capacity field to the restaurant model. And as it says, if you set null equals true, Django will store empty values as null in the database. But I want to raise this caveat below here, where we are told to avoid using null on string-based fields such as a car field and a text field. And that's because if you set null equals true on a string field, that means that there are 2 possible values for no data. You have the null value and you also have the empty string. And in most cases that is redundant, so you want to avoid setting null equals true on these text-based fields in Django. That's just a caveat to mention when you're creating nullable fields on your models. And if we go back to that restaurant model, we have this website field here that we've not really used in this series, but you can see that that's a URL field, which is a subclass of the car field in Django. It's a text-based field. And rather than storing null values by setting null equals true like we did down here in the capacity field, what we've done with the website is we've set a default equal to an empty string. So that means if we're trying to create an instance of a restaurant and we don't pass in a website, it's going to default to that empty string, and that is what represents a missing website from this model. Let's now move on to see how Django handles null values when it's doing ordering. Now in order to demonstrate this, let's go back to the script, and I'm going to remove the filter function, and we're going to replace that with the order by function in the Django ORM, and we're going to order the restaurants by that new capacity field. And once we've got that ordering, we're going to use the .values function, and we're only going to get back the values of the capacity field from the resulting query set. So at the bottom, I'm going to execute the script, and we're going to see the output of that script. And you can see the ordering here. When we order by the capacity field, we have the null values at the start. These are equal to the none value in Python, but basically what's happening is that it's pulling out the none values or the null values at the start of the query set, and you can see at the end of the query set we have the capacity fields that actually have a value. So the rows with the null values come at the start when we use the order by function with a nullable field in Django, as we're doing here. And on the other hand, the non-null values, they come at the end of the query set when we are performing this ordering. So Django treats the null values essentially as less than the non-null values. That might not be desirable, so there are different ways of handling this. For example, you might want the null values at the end of the resulting query set. So let's go to a section of the Django documentation, and that's using the f object to sort out null values. What we can do is to the order by function we can pass an f expression with the field in question, and then we have the .descending and .ascending functions that we can chain to that, and there is a keyword argument that we can pass in there called nulls last, and we can set that to true or false in order to put the null values at the start of the query set or at the end of the query set. So let's see an example of this with our model here. What we're going to do is we're going to import the f expression at the top from django.db.models, and then rather than referring to the field, what we're going to do is we're going to create an f object here, and we're going to refer to that capacity field. And that f object, we can use the .ascending function here, and we can pass that nulls last parameter and set that equal to true in order to move the null values to the end of the query set. So let's execute this function and we're going to see the output of this script. This time we have the two objects that have a capacity that's not null at the start of the query set, and those are ordered in ascending order as per this function here. So we have 10 before 20, and then after those two values we have all of the capacities that are null. And that's because now we have the null's last keyword argument set to true in this .ascending function, and if we want to get this in reverse order, what we can do, for example, is use the .descending function and re-execute the script, and now we're going to see 20 at the start, and the capacity of 10 is now the second object, and as before we have the null values at the end of the query set. Now if you're ordering and you don't want to deal with null values, there is of course another way to deal with this. So what I'm going to do is change the code back to what we had before, and that was this statement here where we are ordering by capacity. But if we don't want to consider null values, what we can do of course is use the .filter function, and we can again use that capacity isnull lookup, and we can set this lookup to false in order to only return the restaurants whose capacity is not null. And then when we have those, we can safely order by the capacity, and we don't need to worry about where null values will fall into the resulting query set. So let's re-execute the script at the bottom, and we can see the output. This time we have the capacity of 10 and 20, and all of the other values have been filtered out of the query set. And again, if we want this in reverse order, we can use this syntax here instead of the .descending and .ascending functions, because we don't need to worry about where the nulls will fall in that query set. So if we re-execute this time we get back the higher value first, because this is now in descending order. Let's now move on to using the coalesce function in Django. So what I'm going to do is go back to Django's documentation, and we're going to go to the page on database functions, which I'll link below the video. Now we've seen a few functions in this series so far. This time we're going to look at the coalesce function in Django. And this function accepts a list of at least 2 field names or expressions, and it will return the first non-null value from that list. So what we're going to do is copy this import statement here, and we're going to bring that into VS Code at the top of our script. So we've imported the coalesce function, and I'm going to remove this statement here. And what we're going to do, just to demonstrate this example, before we run the coalesce function, I'm going to run the restaurant.objects.update function, and we're going to update every single restaurant in the database and set the capacity back to null for every single row. So let's save that file, and we're going to execute that query, and that's going to set the capacity column to null for every restaurant in our database. Now let's imagine that we wanted to take the sum of the capacities in our database for all restaurants. The problem with taking that sum over the capacity column is that every single row has a null value in that column. So how do you take the sum of a column that contains null values? Let's see an example of that now. If we go back to our script here, I'm going to run the restaurant.objects.aggregate function. And what we're going to try and aggregate here is the sum of the capacity column. So let's create a key here called total capacity, and we're going to set that equal to the sum function over the capacity column. And we need to import the sum function from django.db.models, and we're going to print the output of this aggregate call, and we're going to see what happens when we try and sum up the values in this column. So let's execute the script, and you can see that we get a total capacity equal to none. Now what happens if we need to return a number here? We don't want to return none under any circumstances, even though there might be null values in this column. We want to guarantee that when we call the sum aggregation function, we get back a number. So what we can do, or rather one way of solving this, is to use the coalesce function. So when we use the aggregate function in Django, we're passing the sum in here, but what we can actually do is pass the coalesce function, and I'm going to instantiate that, and we pass the sum of the capacity column as the first value, and if that evaluates to null, we can pass in a second expression here. So after the sum of the capacity, we're going to set that equal to 0, and we can close off the coalesce function. So what's going to happen here is going to take each of these values. It's going to look firstly at the capacity column, try and sum that up using Django's sum function, and if that returns a value of null, it's then going to move on to the second argument here, which is just the raw value of 0. So let's save this file, and we can execute the script and see what output we get now. And instead of null, what we're getting back here is the number 0. So the coalesce function can be used here with the aggregate function to make sure that an aggregation does not return none. And coalesce can also help with our filter functions as well. So what I'm going to do is remove this code, and we're going to actually use the rating model here. It's going to be rating.objects.filter. And we know that all ratings have a rating value that's between 1 and 5. So I'm going to add a rating here that will return an empty query set. We're going to look for all ratings that are less than 0. And if we call .aggregate after that, and this time we're going to try and get the average rating, so we're going to use the average function from Django, and we can pass that rating field in there. And again, we need to import average at the top here. So what we're doing in this statement here is we're filtering down to all ratings that are less than 0, and that will return an empty query set, which we're then calling .aggregate, and we're passing in the average aggregation here over the rating field. Now when you try and aggregate over an empty query set, what's going to happen is it's going to return none for that particular aggregation, as you can see below. Now again, in the case where you need to have a non-null value coming back from this function, we can use the coalesce function here and pass in a second argument if the first one evaluates to null. And in this case I'm going to pass in 0.0, and let's execute this and see what we get back. And this time we get back 0.0 here, and we're not getting back none. And that can be important if you want to guarantee again that you're not going to have a null value in your code. Coalesce gives you this fallback that you can use to provide a default value or a secondary value if the initial value evaluates to none. Now there is another way to handle this issue in Django if we're using aggregation functions such as average. I'm going to go back to the way the code was before we used coalesce, and what we can actually do is pass a default in here to the average aggregation function. So we can set the default equal to 0.0, and when we rerun the script at the bottom, this time we get that back, and we don't need to use the coalesce function in this case. So that's quite an important thing to note about Django aggregation functions. You can specify a default value if you're potentially going to get back a none value. Now when we do this default equal to 0.0, if we uncomment connection.queries and look at the resulting query that's being issued against the database, you can see that under the hood, Django will actually use the database coalesce function in order to perform this query. And the coalesce function in a database like Postgres or MySQL is going to work very similar to the Django function. It takes in the first expression here, and if that evaluates to null, it's going to then use the second expression, and we can pass in as many of these expressions as we want until we finally get back a value that is not null. So to finish this video, we're going to create a toy example just to demonstrate something useful that the coalesce function can help us with. Let's go back to models.py, and I'm going to create another new field on the restaurant model. And this is going to be a nullable field that is called nickname. Now let's imagine that restaurants can have a nickname. That might not make a lot of sense, but let's just go with it for this example, and that's a car field. It has a max length of 200 characters, and it's also got the null equals true flag. Let's run the make migrations command at the bottom, and then we can run the migrate command to actually make that change to the database. And if we go back to the restaurant table and refresh this table, you can see that we now have a nickname column at the right hand side, and all values are null. Now let's say that we want to pull out a name for every single restaurant in this table. And we're going to try and get the nickname if it exists, and then we will use that if it does exist. But if it doesn't exist, what we're going to do is fall back to the name column that we have here. Coalesce can help us with this. Let's go back to VS Code and go back to the script, and I'm going to remove this line of code here and comment out connection.queries. Now the function that we're going to write here is restaurant.objects.annotate, and we're going to annotate each restaurant with a new field called name value. And I'm going to bring this code to a new line so that we can see that clearly what we're going to do here. So what the name value is going to do is use the coalesce function, and what we're going to do is use f expressions, and the first argument to coalesce is the one we want to check first and see if that evaluates to null or not. And the field we're going to use there is the nickname field, and if that's not null, it's going to return that nickname. But if it is null, we can provide a second value here, and we're just going to use the normal name field that we have on that particular model. And once we've done that, we can use the .values function, and we're going to get back that annotated field called name value when we print this out to the terminal. So let's clear the terminal, and we're going to execute this script, and you can see the name values that we're getting back. We aren't getting nulls here as we would if we just checked for the nickname, which we know is entirely null in our table. What we're getting back is the fallback, which is the name column. Now what I want to do is set one restaurant's nickname to a non-null value. So let's paste in some code here. We're getting the first restaurant from the database, and we're setting its nickname to some random nickname here, and then we're calling the .save function. So let's do that, and then we are going to rerun this script with that new code added. And you can see the output at the bottom, and for the very first record that's coming back in that query set, you can see that the name value is set to the nickname that we just added there. And that's because when we add that nickname, this statement here with the coalesce function, the nickname will evaluate to non-null, and that will be returned for that particular record, whereas every other record does not have a nickname, so that will fall back to the second field here, which is the name field. So the coalesce function can be handy if you have some data that is kind of matched up and you want to return one particular value, but if that doesn't exist, you want to fall back to a second value. Very useful, and it avoids you writing that if-else logic in your code. You can just use coalesce and the database will handle that logic for you behind the scenes. So that's all for this video. We've covered how to add nullable fields to the database using the null equals true keyword argument. And we've also seen how to use Django's isnull lookup, and I'll leave a link to that one below the video as well. And this can be used with the filter and exclude functions to get back the rows in a table where we filter out or filter in the rows that have null values in a particular column. And we also saw how null values affect ordering in Django and how we can get around the problems that might occur with that. And finally, we've looked at the coalesce function that we can use to provide a fallback if a particular expression evaluates to null. And coalesce is a database function that we import in Django, but the actual calculation, the actual logic is performed at the database level, and that can help simplify our code in these circumstances. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the channel, there's a link to a Ko-fi page in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.